Welcome back to another episode of Live 5 Deep Dive. I'm Nick Reagan, and today we are continuing our exploration of the South Carolina justice system, and today specifically how the state handles sexual abuse cases in minors. I've got investigative reporter Emily Johnson here with me. Emily, thanks for coming in.
Of course, Nick. Thanks for having me again.
All right, this week we had something kind of unusual happening. We saw dozens of child sex abuse cases moving through the Charleston County judicial system in a sort of a move that I haven't seen before, where we had so many going through and making plea deals or having pleas offered to them. Talk to me about what happened this week.
I agree. It was really interesting for us to see this influx in cases. And so basically, we were inside the courtroom on Monday where 22 individuals took plea deals or ended up continuing their cases. And in total, we weren't able to be in the courtroom today and earlier this week on another day that these hearings were going on, but we added it up. And in total, there was around 68 individuals that were going through this process this week. And we reached out to the Attorney General's office because we thought it was a little bit bizarre. And they said this is normal for the Attorney General's office to kind of block off a week to handle these cases in different counties throughout the state. And they said they've been doing this throughout the year in other counties, and they're also doing it in Horry County later this year. But it definitely was something that that's why we went, because we thought it was interesting that it was going on. And I'm glad that we went and, kind of found out why these were taking place this week.
What kind of cases are we talking about?
We're talking about a range of different child sex crimes, but mainly it pertains to either distributing child pornography to people or receiving that and holding those materials, communicating with minor children, whether that's a real victim or if that is somebody that was also an undercover cop posing as a child, which is very common in these undercover operations that the AG's office does handle and kind of launches throughout the state.
Right. So we saw how many cases? 60 plus? Moving through the Charleston County court system.
Yep.
Now, when we're looking at the individual results here, how many of these people actually got jail time? Because as you've already mentioned, there were dozens of cases, and some of the individual charges, the individual descriptions of the charges are fairly horrific, right? Some of the things that are said and alleged. But how many of these people ended up going to jail?
So out of the 22 people that we saw go before a judge on Monday, 4 were sentenced to prison. 5 did take plea deals. They pled guilty, but they did not receive any time behind bars unless they had already served that when they were first arrested. And so that mainly ranged from probation of, either going on the sex offender registry, going on probation between sex offender parole, some sort of actions like that. And then a number also decided not to take those plea deals last minute, which was very interesting. And they will be going to trial at a later date. So we saw a little bit of a range. But in general, if you look at the numbers, the majority of people did not get sentenced to any prison time. If you do the percentages, most people did not have to serve any additional time behind bars for these crimes.
Well, an additional time, that was one of the, that's a key word there, because at least a handful of them were already behind bars and served, 400 days or whatever, and sentenced to another 3 or 4 years. So effectively their sentence was, 2 additional years because of the time served. But we know that this comes at a time where we have the Attorney General running for governor. There is politics at play in the background here. His chief opponent, or one of his chief opponents, Representative Nancy Mace, has called him out and called him soft on these child sex abuse crimes cases. In fact, she published a letter last month that said that Alan Wilson, the Attorney General, has a 7.5% conviction rate in Dorchester County. That means 92.5% of these charges are being dropped or dismissed or what have you. Now, she is conflating charges and convictions. Many of the people that were charged ended up pleading down to 1 charge, opposed to some of them had upwards of 20 plus charges. So the conviction rate that she reports is a little bit, you take that with a grain of salt. However, she also says that she's going to look at the data for the entire state. You have already looked at this particular issue where we have people accused of child sex abuse getting light sentences or no sentences at all. What did you find in your reporting?
So it's funny because we ended up looking into this, I think, at the very beginning of 2025 or springtime of 2025, before it became almost a talking topic,
right, a
political point for both of these candidates. And we looked into it, mainly looking at big news conferences where they bring out the media, and they kind of have this whole task force in front of a camera and are saying they arrested all these people, which is obviously great. We do not want these people on the streets. But once we started looking into the cases individually, most of them and many of them were people serving only either one time in jail, absolutely no time behind bars, not even having to go on the sex offender registry in general, or being repeat offenders. And so once you look at it from a grander scope, and it is hard when we are looking at numbers because each case, like the AG's office tells us, is very unique, and it depends on what evidence they can prove and all of that. But once you look at just the general outcomes for these cases and what these individuals are charged with, it's pretty jarring to see that a lot of them aren't serving an obscene or large amount of time behind bars. And many of them might not even have to go on the sex offender registry, which is a pretty harsh punishment. It's at least 25 years before they can even try and get off of it. So it does hold over individuals for a long time. So it was pretty crazy to see these very broadcasted publicly cases and arrests that ended up really not having a whole lot of accountability, I would say, in the end.
Well, there are two issues here that I see. The first is that obviously some of these cases don't merit the time that perhaps the original charge would suggest, because the evidence just isn't there, or it's hard to tie the evidence to the person, to the defendant. But the other issue that we almost never talk about is from the defendant's standpoint, right? They're arrested, they get put up on TV, and the Attorney General says, these are pedophiles that we've arrested. They haven't been convicted yet, and we put up their charges, et cetera, et cetera. Because of how slow our court system is, these people are in jail for as long as it takes to get through the court system, 3 years possibly, and their lives have been completely altered by the accusation that they are child sex abuse predators, really, right? And so when the Attorney General is not able to get a conviction, or they plead down to something even more minor, not only have we created real victims, but we've also created kind of some people that maybe never would have been criminals in the first place, because the evidence just wasn't there, right? Now, we have gotten an update recently in the case of Judge James Gosnell. We've talked extensively about him. He's the Charleston judge who federal authorities arrested earlier this year, and they say they found a flash drive on him that had hundreds of files of some of the most horrific child sex abuse material that you could possibly have. This week, we got a bit of an update. What did we find out this week?
Well, this week we found a new development in the Gosnell case. John Thorpe was arrested in Florida and charged federally for very similar crimes as Gosnell had been. And it was interesting for all of us because there had been an unnamed man in these original warrants, and kind of as the cases started to unfold, and nobody knew who this was. And so basically, allegedly, Gosnell and Thorpe had been communicating and shared like-minded interests in viewing these materials, kind of discussing these predatory behaviors. And he was officially charged in Florida, but we still don't know to the exact extent. We haven't gotten full transcripts of these text messages other than the filings. So we don't know exactly how long they had been in contact for, what these plans, kind of what lengths they went to. And so it will be interesting once his case continues to move in Florida and as Gosnell's moves in South Carolina to see how much overlap there is, and also to see if there are real victims in these cases and if anyone will be held accountable, or if these two individuals will be held even more accountable than their original charges are holding over them.
Emily, in a lot of ways, the Gosnell case is a perfect example of just how difficult it can be to pin down somebody with these charges, because the evidence is difficult. We know that Gosnell had sent some communications, at least the federal authorities say that they've sent some communications that suggested that he wanted to go on a trip, potentially with this Florida man, and commit some serious child sex abuse acts. But again, the evidence is difficult, right?
And that's the hardest thing, I think, for investigators in the case of Gosnell, is that him and this Thorpe character were communicating about, I think it was Thorpe's nephew. They were talking about potentially raping and killing him. And those charges have not been, or those at least allegations have not been shown in the charges just yet. So I'm assuming, and obviously we're speculating, but it's been probably hard for them to prove that they were legitimately planning this. Were they either just texting about it as an idea? Did Gosnell already purchase his plane ticket to Florida? Did they have a methodically planned out way that they were going to execute this to this young child? And we don't know that yet. And I think maybe now that they have fully charged the Florida man with the similar charges as Gosnell is facing, that maybe more evidence is going to start to kind of unfold as investigators continue their case, other than the initial charges that were probably a little bit easier to find, because that evidence, it's very difficult to find victims in these cases. And that's, I think, probably one of the harder things with the AG's office when it comes down to charging these individuals. And because it's very, sometimes it's materials being passed along from 8 people down the line. So in the courtroom on Monday, for example, the judge is saying, or the Attorney General's office is saying, oh, there's actually no victim in this case. But yet me and our producer are sitting there, how is there no victim in this case if there is video material of an infant or whatnot, a child being abused in this way? But they're saying it's not a victim because it's such third-party material at that point that it's hard to prove that they were the ones either A, committing the crime, or B, being the first one to kind of produce it and send it off to other people. Yeah,
I think they're still sort of struggling with the idea of, was this a sick internet fantasy that they were just communicating about, or does it rise to that level of conspiracy? Now, we do know that Thorpe, at least, has been charged with conspiracy to receive and distribute child pornography and the distribution of child pornography. But in terms of those actual acts, those acts that would amount to rape, I think they're still trying to find the evidence of, again, whether or not their communications were sick internet speak, or if it does rise to that level of conspiracy to commit certain crimes.
Exactly. And I think that's the hardest thing, is that at some point they just want to get these charges at least. So you're getting this alleged predator off the street. And so getting them at least with a few charges initially, but I'm assuming their investigation is still continuing to try and find that and hopefully tack on more charges where there's even potentially more prison time than these initial more minor child exploitation charges than some of these other more aggressive traveling to do these acts. Those pose a much larger punishment.
One of the things I think you found in your reporting earlier this year was that the Attorney General was very keen on, especially some of these cases that don't rise to acts, but to make sure that the people that they did catch in these sting operations are on the sex offender registry list, so that if there is another infraction, there's a history, and that history can be used, and we saw this on Monday, can be used to create stronger sentences the next time there's an infraction. I mean, is that sort of the thinking as to why we start with 30 charges and we move down to just pleading down to 1 because we're trying to get them on the sex offender registry list?
I think you're completely right in that. And one of the individuals that we saw on Monday that was sentenced to prison, he was already on the sex offenders registry from back in the 90s. And something that we haven't shared with the public, but one of his loved ones actually reached out to me afterwards and was asking us about the sentencing and just asking for clarification, which is, the court system is very confusing. So we're always happy to double check our reporting, make sure we were correct as well, because it's pretty fast paced in a courtroom like that. But she even said he was already on the registry in the 90s. We don't want him out just as much as anyone else wants him to be out. And so I think looking at it from a perspective of getting these people on the registry is a great first step, but when it's people that are often recommitting these crimes, how preventable is it really in the grand scheme of things until they do it again? And then we can say, oh, now you have to go to prison for a number of years. But initially, they're not being charged with that. So it's a weird game of kind of a balancing act in a way, I think, for the AG's office, for the state, for judges, just to say, do we have enough here to really hammer down prison time, or is it just enough to at least get them on the registry so if they ever do it again, we can get them to be held accountable for their crimes?
Now, of course, we've still got dozens of cases here in the Charleston County, more in the Tri-County, as well as hundreds across the state. Again, we're going to have another one of these AG trial or court dockets in Horry County early next year, and we've already seen a handful of others in other counties so far this year. We'll have to see what comes out of those, and again, just continue to track all of these cases as best as we can.
Exactly. And I think keeping an eye on these cases to hope that the more that we look at them, the more we can understand them for ourselves and help our viewers understand them, and also the rest of the public, especially now that it's such a political point, making sure that we understand it enough, but also then we can fact check some of these allegations saying these charges were not that many, or this many individuals are actually not charged, because it is a crime that is unlike anything else, especially when you're talking about children. And so I think the more that we keep an eye on it, hopefully the more accountability we can hold to these public officials, the judges, but also the people that are committing the crimes themselves.
Yep. All right, Emily Johnson, thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
If you'd like to learn more about the Judge James Gosnell case, we did an entire Live 5 deep dive on it. You can learn everything about that case up until that point. And of course, we'll continue to follow it and bring you more episodes as soon as more details come out.